Christmas Tides and Mistletoe Rides by Dana Sacco. Copyright. Copyright 2024 by Dana Sacco. All rights reserved. No part of this publication may be reproduced, stored, or transmitted in any form by any means, electronic, mechanical, photocopying, recording, scanning, or otherwise without written permission from the publisher. It is illegal to copy this book, post it to a website, or distribute it by any other means without permission. This novel is entirely a work of fiction. The names, characters, and incidents portrayed in it are the work of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, events, or localities is entirely coincidental. Dana Sacco asserts the moral right to be identified as the author of this work. Designations used by companies to distinguish their products are often claimed as trademarks. All brand names and product names used in this book and on its cover are trade names, service marks, trademarks, and registered trademarks of their respective owners. The publishers and the book are not associated with any product or vendor mentioned in this book. None of the companies referenced within the book have endorsed the book. Book cover by Dana Sacco. Audio narration by Revoicer. Chapter 1. A Lighthouse for the Holidays. The fading sunlight stretched long shadows across the weathered sand scattered from her damp hair, creating tiny constellations on the wooden floor that would definitely earn her another lecture about tracking beach debris inside. "One problem at a time," she muttered, trying to sweep the evidence away with her foot. The scent of her mom's famous snickerdoodles wafted from the kitchen, which usually meant either really good news or really complicated news. With her mom, sometimes it was hard to tell the difference. "Cassie, there you are!" Jillian's voice rang out with that particular tone of enthusiasm that made Cassie's stomach do a little flip. Her mom appeared in the kitchen doorway, flour dusting her cheeks and a knowing smile playing on her lips. "I've got some exciting news." "Of course you do." Cassie padded toward the kitchen, leaving damp footprints in her wake. "What did you volunteer me for this time?" The kitchen counter was covered in cooling racks of perfectly golden cookies, each one decorated with precise swoops of white icing. Classic mom, stress baking before dropping a bombshell. Jillian waved her hand dismissively, sending a small cloud of flour into the air. "Now don't give me that look. You're the town's holiday sweetheart. Who better to decorate the old lighthouse?" The words hit Cassie like a rogue wave. Her jaw dropped as she stared at her mother, waiting for the punchline that didn't come. "Mom, that's a huge job!" The lighthouse had stood sentinel over Seaview Shores for generations. Its weathered white walls holding countless stories of storms, weathered, and ships guided safely home. But for the past few years, it had stood empty, its windows dark and its paint peeling. Cassie had spent countless hours surfing near its base, dreaming up ways to restore it to its former glory. But this was like asking her to redecorate the moon. "Which is why I knew you could handle it," Jillian said, her warm smile unwavering as she pulled another tray of cookies from the oven. "This is your chance to really make the lighthouse shine." Cassie's fingers found the shell pendant around her neck, her nervous habit since she'd found it on the beach as a kid. The lighthouse needed more than just a few strings of lights and some garland. It needed a miracle worker, and her miracle-working schedule was already pretty full between helping at the surf shop, organizing the annual Christmas by the Sea festival, and trying to maintain some semblance of a social life. Before she could voice any of these very reasonable concerns, a blur of motion and mischief burst into the kitchen. Toby skidded across the floor in his sock feet, nearly wiping out on the lingering sand. "The lighthouse? You get to deck it out for Santa's big night? So cool." Her little brother's eyes sparkled with the kind of pure excitement that only a 10-year-old could muster, making it harder for Cassie to voice her doubts. He'd probably already imagined a full-scale winter wonderland, complete with surfing elves and a wave-riding Santa. Jillian stepped closer, giving Cassie's arm a reassuring squeeze. "Just think about it, okay? I know you've got this." The weight of expectations settled on Cassie's shoulders like a heavy winter coat, completely out of place in their sunny coastal town, but impossible to ignore. She managed a nod, watching as her mom herded and still bouncing Toby out of the kitchen, probably to prevent him from snagging cookies before dinner. Left alone, Cassie drifted to the kitchen window. The lighthouse stood proud against the darkening sky, its silhouette a familiar friend on the horizon. The setting sun caught the salt-crusted windows, making them twinkle as if the building was already strung with Christmas lights. It was beautiful, even in its current state of neglect, but the thought of taking on its transformation made her chest tight. She mentally flipped through her calendar, already packed with commitments. There was inventory at the surf shop tomorrow, 3 different festival planning meetings this week, and she'd promised to help Mrs. Martinez teach holiday crafts at the community center. Adding a lighthouse-sized project to that mix seemed about as smart as surfing during a hurricane. But as she stood there, watching the last rays of sunlight paint the lighthouse in shades of gold and pink, determination began to bubble up through the doubt. This was her town, her lighthouse, her chance to create something spectacular. Seaview Shores was counting on her, the girl who'd been stringing lights and hanging wreaths since she could walk, the one who'd turned last year's Christmas by the Sea festival into a viral sensation with her seashell and starfish Christmas tree. Cassie squared her shoulders, her reflection in the window mimicking her stance. The task ahead might seem impossible, but she'd find a way to make this Christmas extraordinary. She had to, because in Seaview Shores, holiday magic wasn't just a saying, it was a way of life. And if anyone could bring that magic to the old lighthouse, it would be her, even if she had absolutely no idea how she was going to pull it off. Cassie's ancient pickup wheezed to a stop at the base of the lighthouse cliff, the engine making one final protest before settling into silence. The morning sun cast long shadows across the gravel lot, empty except for a few seabirds pecking hopefully at discarded chip bags. She grabbed her well-worn sketchbook from the passenger seat, its pages already stuffed with Christmas festival plans and half-finished designs. The familiar weight of it against her chest steadied her nerves as she started up the winding path to the lighthouse. The ocean breeze tugged at her ponytail, carrying the sharp tang of salt and seaweed. Somewhere above, seagulls called to each other, their cries echoing off the rocky cliffs. Her shoes crunched against the sandy path as childhood memories flooded back. Summer days spent watching boats from the lighthouse balcony, winter evenings counting the flash of the beacon through her bedroom window. As she rounded the final bend, the lighthouse emerged in full view, and Cassie's steps faltered. Her breath caught in her throat. The old building commanded attention even in its current state, rising proud and tall against the morning sky. The red and white candy cane stripes, though faded, still wrapped majestically around the cylindrical tower. Delicate gingerbread trim adorned the balcony, like frozen lace, some pieces missing, but the overall effect still enchanting. The keeper's cottage attached to the base told a different story. Cassie ran her hand along the weathered shingles, gray and rough beneath her fingers. Paint curled away in long strips, revealing patches of bare wood underneath. Through cracked window panes, she caught glimpses of dusty furniture draped in white sheets, like long-forgotten ghosts. Her shoes squeaked against the wraparound porch as she surveyed the overgrown garden. Weeds had claimed victory over the flower beds her grandmother used to tend, their thick stems choking out any surviving blooms. In the corner, a rusty swing set creaked in the breeze, its chains wrapped with invasive vines. The sight made her heart ache. She'd spent countless hours on those swings, pumping her legs toward the sky while her dad worked on lighthouse maintenance. But beneath the neglect, Cassie sensed something else. Maybe it was the way sunlight caught the salt-crusted windows, or how the old door still hung straight and true despite years of coastal storms. This place hadn't given up. It was waiting, like a forgotten fairy tale castle, for someone to break the spell. She settled onto the porch steps, ignoring the protest of weathered wood beneath her. Her sketchbook balanced on her knees as she began to draw, pencil flying across the page. The lighthouse's bones emerged in quick, sure strokes. The proud tower, the sweeping balcony, the sturdy keeper's cottage. But as she drew, new elements appeared. Garlands of seashells and pine draping the windows, oversized ornaments catching the sunlight, ribbons of light spiraling up the tower like strands of DNA. The balcony practically begged for a Christmas tree, and not just any tree. Cassie's pencil sketched a massive evergreen, its branches stretching toward the sea. In her mind's eye, she saw it decorated with hand-painted buoys, delicate starfish, and twinkling lights that would be visible from every corner of Seaview Shores. Her excitement building, she flipped to a fresh page and started plotting the ground-level displays. A skating scene materialized under her pencil, life-sized figures carved from driftwood, their skates leaving crystalline trails across a sea of lights. She added playful touches, a seal balancing a present on its nose, penguins wearing surf shorts, a mermaid hanging stockings on a coral reef. The sound of rustling brush pulled her attention away from the page. A family of deer stood frozen at the garden's edge. A doe and two spotted fawns, their ears pricked forward in curiosity. Cassie held her breath, but the neglected state of the property had already spooked them. They bounded away in graceful leaps, disappearing into the tangled undergrowth. She frowned at her surroundings with fresh eyes. The overgrown paths and unstable porch railings weren't just eyesores, they were safety hazards that could keep visitors away. Even the most spectacular Christmas display wouldn't matter if people couldn't safely access the lighthouse. Tucking her sketchbook under her arm, Cassie stood and took one more look at the lighthouse. Beneath the peeling paint and creeping vines, she saw what it could become, a beacon of holiday joy, drawing people from miles around to experience its magic. The task ahead seemed even more daunting now that she'd seen the extent of the neglect up close. But that only strengthened her resolve. She'd grown up watching this lighthouse guide ships safely home through storms and darkness. Now it was her turn to guide it back to life, one string of lights at a time. Cassie tucked her sketchbook into her beach bag and began circling the lighthouse, mentally plotting decoration placement. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered grounds as she paced, measuring distances with her steps. That corner would be perfect for the driftwood skating scene. And over there, nestled between those wind-twisted cypress trees, she could create a tropical Santa's workshop. The crunch of tires on gravel shattered her planning. She spun around, nearly tripping over a chunk of broken concrete. A battered blue pickup truck wheezed its way up the narrow drive, the engine coughing like it might give up at any moment. The truck lurched to a stop, and the driver's door creaked open. A guy unfolded himself from behind the wheel, all sharp angles and messy dark hair that looked like he'd run his fingers through it one too many times. His green Henley was rolled up to the elbows, revealing forearms tanned from outdoor work. "Hey there!" Cassie lifted her hand in a friendly wave, plastering on her best welcome to the neighborhood smile. "I'm Cassie. Are you the new owner?" The guy's eyes narrowed as they swept over her, from her salt-sprayed ponytail down to her sand-dusted flip-flops, like he was assessing a potential security threat rather than a teenage girl. "Ethan," he said finally. "And no, my parents bought this place." His clipped tone made Cassie's smile waver, but she doubled down on the cheerfulness. After all, she'd won over grumpier souls during her years of community service. "Well, it's amazing, isn't it?" She gestured toward the lighthouse tower. "This lighthouse is a Seaview Shores icon. My dad used to help maintain it when I was little, and—" Ethan's shoulder lifted in a dismissive shrug. "If you say so." His gaze drifted over the cracked windows and peeling paint. "Looks like a dump to me." The casual insult felt like a slap. Cassie's fingers curled into fists at her sides, but she kept her voice light. "It just needs some TLC. I'm actually planning to decorate it for the holidays. The Christmas by the Sea festival is coming up." "You?" The word dripped with skepticism as Ethan scoffed. He yanked a worn duffel bag from the truck bed. "Good luck with that. This place is way too big a project for one person." Heat crawled up Cassie's neck, flooding her cheeks. "For your information," she said, lifting her chin, "I'm the town's official holiday sweetheart. Decorating is kinda my thing." The title sounded ridiculous the moment it left her mouth, but she couldn't take it back now. Ethan's eyebrow arched so high it nearly disappeared under his messy hair. "If you say so." The words might have been the same as before, but this time they dripped with condescension. He brushed past her, heading for the cottage entrance. The ancient porch boards groaned under his heavy boots. Cassie watched him go, hands planted firmly on her hips. The sting of his dismissal prickled under her skin, but she refused to let it take root. She'd faced down plenty of holiday skeptics before. The grumpy shop owner who'd sworn he'd never participate in the window display contest until her Winter Wonderland design won him first place. The retired teacher who'd insisted the community center didn't need decorations until she saw the children's faces light up at the paper snowflake forest. This lighthouse would be her masterpiece. She could already picture it gleaming against the winter sky, a beacon of holiday cheer visible from every corner of Seaview Shores. And if proving that rude new guy wrong happened to be an added bonus, well, that was just a sprinkling of extra Christmas magic. The slam of the cottage door echoed across the grounds. Cassie pulled out her phone and started snapping reference photos, deliberately turning her back on the house. She had work to do, and no amount of green-eyed skepticism was going to derail her plans. The sea breeze tugged at her ponytail as she documented every angle of the lighthouse. Her mind raced with possibilities. Garlands cascading from the balcony, oversized ornaments catching the sunlight, a massive tree visible through the tower windows. Each dismissive word from Ethan only fueled her creativity, transforming into twinkling lights and shimmering decorations in her mental blueprint. She paused at the base of the tower, tilting her head back to study the weathered height. The morning sun caught the salt-crusted windows, making them sparkle despite their neglected state. Even worn down and forgotten, the lighthouse hadn't lost its dignity. It still stood proud against the sky, waiting for someone to remember its worth. "Just you wait," Cassie whispered, patting the sun-warmed bricks. "We'll show him what a little holiday spirit can do." Chapter 2. Rough Waters. First Meetings. The morning sun glinted off the lighthouse windows as Cassie pulled the ancient pickup truck into the gravel drive. The bed was loaded with cleaning supplies, sketch pads, and her trusty emergency decoration kit, because you never knew when inspiration might strike. She hopped out, inhaling the salty breeze that ruffled the papers sticking out of her oversized tote bag. The cottage door creaked open, and Ethan emerged. Wiping his hands on a rag that might have once been white, but was now a symphony of grease stains. His expression landed somewhere between annoyed and incredulous. "You're actually going through with this?" Cassie squared her shoulders, channeling every ounce of holiday spirit she could muster. "Of course. I need to get a full look at the place before I start planning decorations." She patted her tote bag. "Can't create magic without a proper blueprint." Ethan's eyes rolled skyward, as if searching for patience in the clouds. After a long moment, he let out a resigned sigh that seemed to come from his boots. "Fine, I'll give you the grand tour." He jabbed a finger in her direction. "Just don't get any ideas about going overboard." The cottage's front door protested, with a drawn-out creak as they stepped inside. Cassie's fingers traced along a nearby shelf, leaving a clean stripe in the thick layer of dust. Afternoon light filtered through grimy windows, illuminating swirling dust motes and patches of wallpaper that curled away from the walls like autumn leaves. The hardwood floors groaned beneath their feet, but beneath the wear and neglect, Cassie could see hints of the building's former charm. "This place used to be so charming," she murmured, her designer's eye already reimagining the space. She gestured toward an empty corner near the bay window. "Just imagine it all decked out for the holidays, with a tree right there. We could do a nautical theme, maybe silver and blue ornaments, some rope garland." "We're not turning it into a gingerbread house," Ethan cut her off, his voice sharp enough to slice through her mental Pinterest board. "We just want it functional, not some kitschy Christmas attraction." Cassie bit her tongue so hard she nearly tasted tinsel. She followed him toward the spiral staircase that wound up into the tower proper, her fingers trailing along the iron railing. The steps were narrow and steep, forcing her to watch her footing carefully. At the tower's base, a heavy door with patches of rust around its hinges opened onto the wraparound balcony. The view knocked the breath clean out of her lungs. The ocean stretched endlessly toward the horizon, its surface dancing with diamond-bright reflections of sunlight. Below, waves hammered against the rocky shoreline in a timeless rhythm. The town of Seaview Shores spread out to their left, a picture-perfect collection of colorful buildings and winding streets that looked like a holiday card waiting to happen. "This is incredible," Cassie whispered, drinking in the panorama. The breeze up here was stronger, carrying the pure scent of salt and possibility. But Ethan was already retreating inside, his boots clanking against the metal floor. "Balcony's off limits for now. It's not up to code." He didn't even pause to appreciate the view. The rest of the tour felt like speed dating with architecture. Ethan rushed her through each room, rattling off structural issues and repair plans with all the enthusiasm of someone reading a grocery list. Every time Cassie tried to interject with an idea, "Those window seats would be perfect for holiday pillows," or "What if we hung mistletoe from that beam?" he shut her down with increasing irritation. No glitter near the electrical work. "The banister can't support garland weight. We're not putting lights on the exterior until spring." Finally, after what felt like the 100th rejection, Cassie threw up her hands. "Look, I get that you don't care about the holiday stuff." Her voice echoed slightly in the empty front room. "But this lighthouse means everything to my town. It's been part of our Christmas celebration for generations." She gestured at the bare walls and empty corners. "Can't you let me make it magical? Just this once?" The silence that followed was thick enough to spread on toast. Ethan stood with his arms crossed, his expression as immovable as the lighthouse itself. Dust particles danced in the shaft of sunlight between them, like tiny stars waiting to see which way the wind would blow. "This isn't about magic," he said finally, each word measured and firm. "It's about turning a liability into a business. My parents sank everything they had into this place, and I'm not going to let some over-the-top holiday spectacle derail our renovation timeline." The way he said holiday spectacle, like it was something sticky he'd found on the bottom of his shoe, made Cassie's chest tight. She opened her mouth to argue, but Ethan was already moving toward the door, clearly considering the tour and the conversation finished. "If you want a sketch or whatever, fine," he called over his shoulder. "Just stay out of the way of the actual work." The door slammed shut behind him, leaving Cassie for. She pulled out her sketchbook, trying to ignore the way her fingers trembled slightly with frustration. The empty pages seemed to mock her, but she gripped her pencil tighter. One grumpy lighthouse keeper's son wasn't going to stop Christmas. She'd just have to find a way to prove that holiday magic and practical renovation could coexist, preferably without strangling anyone with tinsel in the process. Cassie studied Ethan's face as silence filled the dusty lighthouse interior. His shoulders were rigid with tension as he raked a hand through his dark hair, mussing it further. The late afternoon sun streaming through the windows cast shadows across his jaw, which was clenched tight enough to crack walnuts. "You don't understand," he said finally, his voice lower and less defensive than before. "This lighthouse isn't just some holiday decoration project for me." He pushed away from the doorframe and leaned against the tower's curved wall, letting his shoulders slump. The change in his posture made him look younger somehow, more vulnerable. "My parents sank every penny they had into buying this place." The words hit Cassie like a splash of cold ocean water. Her mind flashed to the ancient truck she'd seen in the driveway, the worn work boots Ethan wore, the way he seemed to carry the weight of the lighthouse's repairs on his shoulders. She hadn't realized, hadn't even thought to consider, what might be at stake for his family. "If we can't get the renovations done and the B&B up and running soon," his voice trailed off, and he swallowed hard, Adam's apple bobbing. The pain in his expression made her chest tight. "You'll have to sell," Cassie finished softly. The realization settled over her like sea fog, heavy and cold. No wonder he'd bristled at her talk of garland and fairy lights. Her Christmas dreams probably seemed frivolous compared to keeping his family's investment from sinking. Ethan nodded, turning away to gaze out the window. Below, waves crashed against the rocky shoreline in a steady rhythm that seemed to mock the uncertainty in his voice. "This was supposed to be our fresh start." The silence that stretched between them felt as vast as the ocean view. Cassie worried her bottom lip, hating how defeated he looked. This wasn't the sardonic boy who dismissed her decoration plans minutes ago. This was someone who carried real fears beneath his prickly exterior. "Hey." She took a step closer, waiting until he reluctantly met her gaze. I'm sorry, I didn't know, but we can make this work. A flicker of something, maybe hope, maybe skepticism, crossed his face. How? Renovations are already insanely behind schedule as it is. He gestured at the half-finished walls, the exposed wiring, the tools scattered across makeshift work tables. But Cassie's mind was already whirring, pieces clicking into place like ornaments finding their perfect spots on a tree. Leave the decorations to me, she said, growing more confident with each word. I'll bring in some extra hands to help too. My friend Leela's mom runs the hardware store. She might be able to get us supplies at cost. And the community center always has volunteers looking for holiday projects. She watched as the tension in his shoulders eased slightly. Taking that as encouragement, she continued. Plus, I know every contractor in town. My dad's crew might be willing to pitch in on weekends if we sweeten the deal with my mom's famous hot chocolate. You'd do all that? Ethan asked, studying her face like he was trying to solve a puzzle. Why? Cassie shrugged, offering him a reassuring smile. Because this lighthouse matters to everyone in Seaview Shores, not just your family. It deserves to shine again, and I promise, no kitsch. She raised her right hand solemnly. Just lighthouse magic. A hint of his earlier skepticism returned. Lighthouse magic? You know that feeling you get when you stand up in the tower at sunset watching the sky turn gold over the water. She gestured toward the spiral staircase. The way the light plays off the brass fixtures, how the windows frame the perfect view of the harbor. Her voice softened. The sense that you're part of something bigger than yourself, something that's been guiding people home for generations. Ethan was quiet for a long moment, his green eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her cheeks warm. Finally, he cleared his throat. That's actually not a bad description. I have my moments, Cassie said, trying to keep her tone light despite the flutter in her stomach. So what do you say? Partners in lighthouse restoration? He hesitated, then pushed away from the wall. I still have final say on anything that might impact the renovation schedule. Of course. And no glitter bombs. Not even tiny ones. The corner of his mouth twitched. Not even microscopic ones. Fine. Cassie held out her hand. Deal? Ethan looked at her offered hand for a moment before reaching out to shake it. His palm was warm and calloused against hers, his grip firm but not overwhelming. Deal. As they stood there, hands clasped in the golden afternoon light, Cassie couldn't help but feel that maybe this was its own kind of lighthouse magic. The moment when two very different paths suddenly aligned, pointing toward the same distant shore. The sound of a hammer echoing from somewhere below broke the spell. Ethan dropped her hand and stepped back, clearing his throat again. I should get back to work. There's a crew coming tomorrow to start on the electrical system. Right, Cassie said, reaching for her sketchbook. I'll just start planning some non-glitter-based decoration options. He nodded, already heading for the door, but he paused in the doorway, glancing back over his shoulder. Cassie? Yeah? Thanks. The word was quiet but sincere, and then he was gone, his footsteps echoing down the spiral staircase. A deep rumble of thunder shattered the moment, making Cassie jump. She hurried to the lighthouse windows, her heart racing as dark clouds rolled in from the sea like an inky tide. The storm had appeared, seemingly out of nowhere, transforming the golden afternoon into an ominous twilight. Looks like a storm is brewing, Ethan noted, his footsteps creaking across the old floorboards as he joined her at the window. Might want to rethink those outdoor decorating plans. Cassie's initial excitement dimmed for a moment as she watched the waves grow choppier, white caps appearing where calm waters had been minutes before. But then something clicked in her mind, like the first spark of a Christmas light string coming to life. Or, she spun around to face him, her eyes bright. We could use it to our advantage. Ethan's eyebrow rose skeptically, his arms crossing over his chest. Use a storm? For decorations? How does that work exactly? The ideas were flowing faster than Cassie could contain them. She began pacing the room, her sneakers squeaking against the worn wooden floor. We lean into it, make the whole theme about weather and the ocean's power. Another crack of thunder punctuated her words, as if nature itself approved of her plan. Her hands flew through the air as she described her vision, turning in circles as she mapped it out. Picture this. Wind-swept trees, their branches draped with lights that look like they're being blown by an eternal breeze. She gestured toward the windows. Icicle lights cascading down the tower like frozen waves caught mid-crash against the lighthouse. The storm outside grew stronger, rain now pelting the windows, but Cassie barely noticed. She was too caught up in her creative surge. And then, this is the best part, we create these amazing drifts of snow using spun glass and glitter. She swept her arm in a wide arc. It'll look like the lighthouse is emerging from this magical blizzard, like something out of a fairy tale. A flash of lightning illuminated the room, and in that brief moment, Cassie caught something unexpected on Ethan's face. Interest. The perpetual furrow in his brow had softened, and a hint of a smile appeared on his face. That could actually look kind of cool, he admitted, uncrossing his arms. Atmospheric. Exactly. Cassie couldn't contain her grin. Finally, they were on the same wavelength. We'll make it a full immersive experience. When people walk up the path, they'll feel like they're entering this winter wonderland by the sea. She moved to the center of the room, her hands sculpting invisible shapes in the air. And right here, in the center of the yard, the piece de resistance. She paused for dramatic effect. An ice sculpture. The rain drummed against the windows, creating a rhythmic backdrop to her enthusiasm. Ethan stepped closer, his green eyes focused on the space where she was gesturing. A wave, maybe? He suggested, then added with a hint of playfulness. Or a mermaid? Cassie beamed at him, warmth spreading through her chest despite the growing chill in the room. This was the first time she'd seen him truly engage with an idea, offering his own suggestions instead of just shooting hers down. Either would be perfect. We could even combine them, a mermaid riding the crest of a wave. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the lighthouse, something had shifted. The tension that had crackled between them since their first meeting had transformed into something else, a spark of shared creativity, a glimpse of what they might accomplish together. Cassie hugged her sketchbook to her chest, already mentally drafting designs. The sound of rain against the windows mixed with the distant crash of waves, creating nature's own soundtrack to their planning session. She watched as Ethan walked the perimeter of the room, his expression thoughtful as he considered angles and logistics. We'd need to figure out lighting, he mused, more to himself than to her. Maybe some spotlights angled up from the ground to catch the ice sculpture just right. He paused by one of the windows, and we'd have to time it carefully. Can't put the sculpture up too early, or it'll melt before the festival. The fact that he was thinking through practical considerations rather than dismissing her ideas outright made Cassie's heart soar. She quickly flipped open her sketchbook, not wanting to lose any of these details. We could talk to Mr. Peterson at the ice company, she suggested, pencil flying across the page. He does amazing work. Did you see the swan fountain he made for the summer festival? I haven't been here that long, Ethan reminded her, but his tone was lighter than usual. Just moved in last month. Right, sorry. Cassie looked up from her sketching. Well, trust me, he's incredible. And he owes me a favor after I helped his daughter with her surfing lessons last summer. Another rumble of thunder shook the lighthouse, and this time they both jumped. Ethan glanced at his watch and frowned. We should probably head down before this gets worse. The stairs can get slippery when it's storming like this. Cassie nodded, reluctantly closing her sketchbook, but her mind was still racing with possibilities, each crack of lightning illuminating new ideas in her imagination. As they made their way toward the spiral staircase, she couldn't help but feel that the storm had brought more than just rain and thunder. It had washed away some of the walls between them, revealing glimpses of the person Ethan might be beneath his guarded exterior. Chapter 3. Seashells and Snowflakes. Cassie spread her sketchbook across the weathered workbench, the pages rustling in the salty breeze that snuck through the lighthouse windows. Her fingers trembled slightly with excitement as she smoothed out the corners, revealing sketch after detailed sketch of her holiday vision. The graphite drawings sprawled across multiple pages, some rough and energetic, others meticulously detailed. She'd stayed up half the night working on them, fueled by hot chocolate and determination. Now, watching Ethan's face as he studied them, she felt her stomach do a nervous flip. So, here's what I'm thinking. Cassie's hands flew into motion, punctuating each point of her plan. We start with the approach. Strings of icicle lights cascading down, creating this amazing wave effect. She traced the path with her finger. Then we line the walkway with these driftwood Christmas trees. Look, each one will be different, decorated with shells and starfish and sea glass. Ethan's expression remained carefully neutral as she continued, though she caught the slight furrow forming between his brows. She pushed forward anyway, her voice gaining momentum. And here, along the railing, we'll weave rope lights through actual fishing nets, creating this gorgeous glowing effect. Oh, and these little touches of silver and blue everywhere will make it feel like the whole place is sparkling with sea spray. She flipped to the next page, her enthusiasm bubbling over. But the real showstopper? Right here in the front yard. Cassie tapped the centerpiece sketch dramatically. A 10-foot wave sculpture carved entirely from ice. When the lights hit it just right, it'll look like it's frozen in mid-crash, with all these amazing details catching the glow. Woo! Ethan let out a low whistle, running a hand through his dark hair. That's ambitious. You know how much fancy ice carvings cost, right? Cassie's excitement wavered slightly, but she'd prepared for this. Well, I was actually hoping we could get a local artist to donate their time, for the exposure and community spirit. Even as she said it, she could hear how uncertain it sounded. Ethan picked up one of the sketches, examining it with a critical eye. And all these lights, the icicles, the rope lights, the uplighting for the sculpture. He gestured at the aging walls around them. Pretty sure our electrical system can't handle that kind of load. The wiring in this place is ancient. With each word, Cassie felt her grand vision deflating. She watched as Ethan flipped through more pages, pointing out practical concerns she hadn't considered. The cost of weatherproof extension cords, the wind factor for hanging decorations, the manpower needed for installation. And where exactly are we storing all these decorations before setup? He asked, gesturing at her elaborate plans. The storage room is already packed with renovation supplies. Cassie's throat felt tight as she watched her carefully crafted dream being dismantled point by point. Each practical objection hit like a tiny dart, deflating her enthusiasm until it felt as flat as the sketches on the table. Ethan must have noticed her falling expression because his tone softened slightly. Don't get me wrong, the theme is cool. The whole nautical Christmas thing, that could work. But maybe we should scale it back a bit? Something more manageable? Heat crept into Cassie's cheeks, her earlier excitement curdling into something that felt uncomfortably like embarrassment, and beneath that, a spark of anger. Or maybe, she said, her voice sharper than intended, you could try seeing the vision instead of just focusing on all the problems. I'm just being realistic here. Ethan's hands flew up in frustration. This place needs actual work, not an extreme holiday makeover. You know what? Cassie cut him off, gathering her sketches with quick, jerky movements. The pages crumpled slightly in her grip, but she was too upset to care. Forget it. I'll figure it out on my own. She shoved the sketchbook into her bag, trying to ignore how her eyes stung. This was supposed to be exciting, a chance to create something magical. Instead, she felt like a little kid who'd been patted on the head and told to be more realistic. The workbench scraped against the floor as she pushed away from it, the sound harsh in the sudden silence. Her footsteps echoed off the lighthouse walls as she headed for the door, each step fueled by equal parts hurt and determination. Behind her, she heard Ethan start to say something, but she didn't slow down. The old door creaked as she yanked it open, letting in a blast of cool air that carried the tang of salt and seaweed. She let it slam behind her with more force than necessary, taking grim satisfaction in the loud bang that followed her out into the gray afternoon. The dying sun cast long shadows through the lighthouse windows as Ethan sorted through a stack of renovation permits. The scratching of his pen against paper filled the quiet space until a familiar rumble of engine and crunch of tires on gravel caught his attention. He glanced out the window to see Cassie's beat-up blue pickup truck pulling into the lighthouse drive, kicking up dust in its wake. His stomach did an uncomfortable flip. After their argument earlier, he hadn't expected her to return so soon, or at all. Yet there she was, yanking open her truck door with enough force to make the hinges protest. Cassie burst through the cottage door moments later, arms laden with brown paper bags, her cheeks still flushed either from anger or the crisp ocean breeze. Maybe both. Her ponytail had come loose, wisps of blonde hair framing her face as she determinedly avoided meeting his gaze. "I thought you'd given up on this extreme holiday makeover," Ethan said dryly, making air quotes with his fingers before he could stop himself. Real smooth, he thought immediately after. The look Cassie shot him could have frozen the ocean solid. Like I'd ever give up that easily. She dropped the bags onto the workbench with a clatter and upended the nearest one. A cascade of handmade ornaments tumbled out, delicate glass spheres in various sizes, each one painted or etched with intricate nautical designs. Ethan moved closer, his curiosity getting the better of him. He picked up one of the larger ornaments, turning it carefully in his hands. The glass caught the late afternoon light, revealing an incredibly detailed sea turtle etched into its surface. Every scale and shadow had been carefully rendered, giving the creature an almost lifelike quality as it seemed to swim through waves carved into the surrounding glass. "You made these?" The words came out softer than he intended, tinged with genuine admiration. "They're actually kind of neat." Something in Cassie's expression shifted at the compliment, the ice in her eyes thawing just slightly. She opened her mouth as if to respond, but before she could speak, Ethan rotated the ornament to examine the other side. The world seemed to slow down as his fingers slipped on the smooth surface. The glass sphere tumbled from his grasp, and that horrible moment of recognition hit. The knowledge that you're about to break something precious, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. The ornament shattered against the wooden floor with a sickening crunch. Fragments of glass scattered across the planks like diamonds, catching the sunlight in a cruel mockery of beauty. The etched sea turtle was now nothing more than glittering shards at their feet. Horror washed over Ethan as he stared at the remains of Cassie's handiwork. "Cassie, I'm so sorry. That was stupid of me. I didn't mean to." "Save it." Each word fell from her lips like an icy dagger, sharp enough to slice through any excuse he might offer. Her hands had balled into fists at her sides, knuckles white with tension. "Clearly you don't care about any of this anyway." Before he could respond, she spun on her heel and stalked toward the lighthouse stairs. Ethan ran a frustrated hand through his hair, messing it up even further. "That's not true. But Cassie had already disappeared up the winding staircase, her footsteps echoing off the walls until even those faded away. Ethan stood rooted to the spot, surrounded by the glittering remains of her ornament, feeling every bit the jerk he probably was. The broken glass winked up at him accusingly. Each shard seemed to reflect a different moment from their interactions. His dismissal of her ideas, his practical objections that probably sounded more like criticism, and now this. He crouched down, carefully beginning to gather the larger pieces, trying not to cut himself on the sharp edges. The sea turtle's eye, miraculously intact in one fragment, stared up at him reproachfully. Ethan had seen plenty of Cassie's handiwork around town. The creative window displays at the surf shop, the hand-painted signs for local events. But these ornaments were different. The level of detail, the careful attention to each tiny element. These weren't just decorations. They were art, and he'd just destroyed one because he couldn't keep his clumsy hands to himself. The sound of footsteps overhead reminded him that Cassie was still in the lighthouse, probably adding more items to her mental list of reasons why Ethan Carter was the worst possible person to work with on this project. He gathered the last of the glass shards, wrapped them carefully in paper, and dropped them into the trash bin. The soft tinkle they made as they fell seemed to echo his own sinking feeling. A gust of wind rattled the windows, carrying with it the distant sound of waves crashing against the rocks below. The lighthouse creaked and settled around him, its old bones seeming to sympathize with the tension filling its spaces. Somewhere above, Cassie was probably working on more of her holiday plans he'd dismissed as impractical and over the top just hours ago. Now, staring at the remaining ornaments on the workbench, each one a testament to hours of patient craftsmanship, Ethan wondered if maybe he was the one who needed to adjust his perspective. Ethan stood at the lighthouse's front desk, sorting through invoices when the creak of wooden boards outside made him tense. Through the salt-sprayed windows, a familiar silhouette appeared. His stomach did an uncomfortable flip as Cassie stepped into the doorway, backlit by the morning sun. She looked different today, hair pulled back in a neat braid instead of her usual messy ponytail, wearing what he guessed was her serious business outfit, a crisp white button-down and dark jeans. The change made him even more nervous about what was coming. "I've been thinking about your concerns," Cassie said, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. Her eyes focused somewhere around his left shoulder rather than meeting his gaze directly. "About the budget and power and all that." Ethan nodded, the guilt from yesterday's ornament incident still churning in his gut. "Look, Cassie, about yester." She held up a hand, cutting him off mid-sentence. "You were right that my ideas were a little over the top, at least logistically." The words seemed to cost her something to say, but her chin lifted slightly as she continued. "So I started over from scratch." Reaching into her worn canvas tote, Cassie pulled out a new sketchbook, noticeably thinner than the elaborate portfolio she'd brought yesterday. She moved to the desk, clearing a space between stacks of paperwork before laying it down. As she opened the book, Ethan found himself leaning forward despite his reservations. The first page revealed a simplified version of her original design, but the changes were immediately apparent. Gone were the elaborate light sculptures and powered displays, replaced by something more elegant. "Icicle lights, but less of them," Cassie explained, her finger tracing the clean lines of her sketch. "Focused on illuminating the architecture, not recreating a snowstorm." She'd drawn the lighthouse in profile, showing how the lights would accent its natural features rather than overwhelm them. The next page revealed what looked like a Christmas tree, but unlike any he'd seen before. "It's made entirely of driftwood," she said, pointing out the details, "with shells instead of ornaments. Completely solar-powered and battery-operated." The design was clever. During the day, it would look like a piece of beach art, while at night, tiny lights nestled in the driftwood would make it glow from within. As she continued walking him through each adjustment, Ethan felt his earlier doubts beginning to dissolve. She'd taken every practical concern he'd raised and found a creative solution. The ice sculptures became sand art. The powered light show transformed into strategically placed spotlights that would use a fraction of the electricity. Each modification preserved the spirit of her vision while addressing his practical concerns. And for the centerpiece, Cassie flipped to the final page with a flourish. The sketch showed a massive wave, frozen mid-crest, but instead of ice or lights, it was designed to be carved entirely from white sand. The detail was incredible. He could almost feel the spray coming off the top of the wave. See how it would catch and reflect the lighthouse beam at night. Ethan let out a slow whistle before he could stop himself. "That's actually really brilliant." He traced the outline of the wave with his finger, noting how she'd incorporated the natural slope of the ground into the design. "Still gets the ocean vibe without breaking the bank." Cassie watched him, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. For all her professional demeanor, he could see the hint of uncertainty in her expression. "So, can we make this work? A compromise between my vision and your practicality?" The hope in her voice made something twist in his chest. He found himself studying the sketches again, but this time he was looking at the little notes in the margins. Calculations for power usage, estimated material costs, even tide tables to determine the best time to build the sand sculpture. She'd done her homework, and then some. "You really reworked all of this overnight?" he asked, glancing up at her. A slight blush colored her cheeks. "Well, I couldn't sleep anyway. Might as well put the time to good use." She tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, a nervous gesture that somehow made her look more like the Cassie he'd first met. "Plus, I had some help from my mom's contractor friend with the electrical estimates." Ethan ran a hand through his hair, aware that he probably looked as conflicted as he felt. The new plans were solid, more than solid. They were actually inspiring. But something else was nagging at him, something that had nothing to do with budgets or practical concerns. Listen, he started, then stopped, trying to find the right words. These plans are great, really great, but I need to apologize for yesterday. The ornament. I should have been more careful. Cassie's expression softened slightly. It was an accident. I know that. I probably overreacted a little. She gestured at the sketches spread between them. Besides, sometimes breaking things leads to better solutions, right? The tension in Ethan's shoulders eased slightly. He looked down at the wave design again, seeing it with fresh eyes. Maybe she was right. Maybe sometimes you had to break down the original idea to build something stronger. Okay, he said finally. Let's do it. Your vision, my practical constraints, working together instead of against each other. He held out his hand, feeling oddly formal. Partners? A smile broke across Cassie's face, bright enough to rival any Christmas display she could dream up. She took his hand, her grip firm and sure. Partners. Chapter 4. A Spark of Creativity. Cassie took a step back, tilting her head to admire their handiwork. The icicle lights draped elegantly along the lighthouse's curved walls, catching the late afternoon sun in a way that promised magic once darkness fell. They'd managed to highlight the building's natural grace without overwhelming it, exactly as she'd hoped. A poorly suppressed giggle shattered her moment of satisfaction. She spun around, already recognizing that particular sound of impending trouble. Toby, what are you doing here? Her little brother emerged from behind a mountain of decoration boxes, his arms full of green sprigs that made her stomach drop. That distinctive white-berried plant could only be one thing. Helping with decorations, duh? Toby's grin stretched from ear to ear as he brandished the mistletoe like a prize. Can't have a proper Christmas setup without some mistletoe, right, Cassie? He waggled his eyebrows in an exaggerated way that made him look like a tiny, demented cartoon character. Heat crept up Cassie's neck as she lunged forward, trying to swat the plants from his hands. We are not hanging that everywhere, you little troll. But Toby was already scrambling up the nearest ladder with the agility of a monkey who'd consumed way too much sugar. Why not? He called down, securing the first sprig above the doorway with practiced ease. Afraid you might get caught under it with someone? Like who? Cassie sputtered, her cheeks burning hotter by the second. There's no one here except... The realization hit her like a wave of ice water. Toby's snicker echoed off the lighthouse walls. Oh, I'm just thinking of your buddy Ethan over there. He reached into his pocket, producing even more mistletoe with the flourish of a cut-rate magician. Across the room, Ethan looked up from the massive tangle of lights he'd been working on, confusion written across his features at the sound of his name. His hair was slightly mussed from running his hands through it in frustration, and there was a smudge of dust on his cheek that made him look oddly vulnerable. Don't you dare, Cassie hissed, grabbing Toby's ankle and giving it a firm yank. Her brother cackled with unholy glee as he lost his balance, arms pinwheeling. The remaining mistletoe went flying, sprigs scattering across the floor like some kind of romantic disaster zone. Cassie groaned and buried her face in her hands, wishing the lighthouse floor would open up and swallow her whole. Through her fingers, she could see Ethan still watching the scene unfold, his expression a perfect mix of bewilderment and something else she couldn't quite read. What's going on? He asked, carefully setting down his strand of lights. Did we have mistletoe on the approved decoration list? We definitely did not, Cassie said, shooting a glare at her brother, who was now sprawled dramatically on the floor as if he'd survived some great tragedy. Someone decided to add his own creative touch without consulting the design team. Hey, I'm totally part of the design team, Toby protested, sitting up and brushing dust off his clothes. I'm the romance consultant. The what now? Ethan's eyebrows shot up. You know, the person in charge of making sure there's enough opportunity for. Toby puckered his lips and made exaggerated kissing sounds. That's it! Cassie lunged for her brother, but he was already scrambling to his feet and darting behind Ethan. Save me! Toby clutched at Ethan's shirt. She's gone mad with power. All I wanted was to spread a little holiday love. Ethan stood frozen, clearly unsure whether to be amused or alarmed by suddenly becoming a human shield. He glanced between the siblings, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, despite his obvious attempt to remain neutral. Don't you dare take his side, Cassie warned, pointing an accusatory finger. He's like a Christmas gremlin. Give him one chance, and suddenly the whole lighthouse will be covered in mistletoe and heart-shaped decorations. Would that be so terrible? Toby peeked around Ethan's arm with an innocent expression that fooled exactly no one. Mom says the B&B needs to be romantic. What's more romantic than mistletoe? Actual tasteful decorations? Cassie suggested, trying to circle around Ethan to get at her brother. But Toby just kept rotating, keeping Ethan between them like some kind of mistletoe-themed game of Ring Around the Rosie. Guys, Ethan's voice had a slight strain to it. Maybe we could focus on cleaning up the mess before someone slips on all this greenery? Cassie stopped her pursuit, suddenly aware of how ridiculous they must look. Here she was, supposedly the responsible one in charge of decorating, chasing her little brother around like a 5-year-old, while their carefully organized workspace descended into chaos. You're right, she sighed, running a hand through her hair. Toby, help me pick these up, and no sneaking any into the decoration boxes. Fine, Toby grumbled, releasing his death grip on Ethan's shirt. But I'm keeping the one above the door, for tradition's sake. Cassie opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. The mistletoe did look kind of pretty up there, catching the light in a way that complemented their other decorations. And it was traditional, even if her brother's motivations were less than pure. One sprig, she conceded. But if you try to add any more, I'm telling Mom about the time you used her good tablecloth as a superhero cape. You wouldn't, Toby gasped, clutching his chest in mock horror. Try me, little brother. Cassie bent down to gather the scattered mistletoe, careful not to look in Ethan's direction. She could still feel the heat in her cheeks, and she definitely didn't need to see whatever expression he might be wearing. Cassie's heart was still racing from the mistletoe incident when her mother's cheerful voice rang through the lighthouse cottage. This is looking great, you two. Jillian Harper breezed in, her festive sweater adorned with tiny jingle bells that announced her every movement. She beamed at the half-decorated space, clasping her hands together in delight. Cassie shoved Toby away before he could open his mouth. Thanks, Mom. We're trying something different this year. She emphasized the we while shooting a meaningful glance at Ethan, who was suddenly very interested in adjusting a string of lights. Oh, the nautical theme is perfect. Her mother moved closer to inspect the driftwood tree they'd assembled. So creative. And those shell ornaments are just... A blur of motion caught Cassie's eye. Toby had slipped behind the tree, and she could see his hands moving quickly, but couldn't quite make out what he was doing. Something about his posture set off warning bells in her head. Absolutely darling, her mother continued, then stopped abruptly. Oh my! Cassie turned to see what had caused her mother's startled expression and felt her stomach drop. Where her carefully crafted shell ornaments had been, a plastic hula dancer now swayed gently, her grass skirt clashing horrifically with the elegant coastal theme. Next to it, a bright yellow rubber duck sporting a Santa hat bobbed cheerfully. And was that? Yes, that was definitely a hot pink flamingo wearing sunglasses and holding a tiny surfboard. That's certainly a unique look, her mother managed, tilting her head as if viewing the decorations from a different angle might make them less bizarre. You little brat, Cassie's voice cracked with indignation. I spent hours weaving those shell garlands. She lunged for Toby, but he was already darting away, cackling like a demented elf. From the corner of her eye, she caught Ethan pressing his lips together, shoulders shaking with barely suppressed laughter. Don't you dare, she warned him, which only seemed to make it harder for him to keep a straight face. I'm sure we can fix it, her mother said diplomatically, reaching for the rubber duck. Though I have to admit, there's something rather charming about. Mom, no. But Cassie's warning came too late. While they'd been distracted by the tree, Toby had gotten his hands on another string of lights. The multicolored bulbs now hung in a distinctly questionable shape, blinking in an attention-grabbing pattern that made its crude nature impossible to ignore. What is that supposed to be? Ethan squinted at the flashing display, his expression shifting from confusion to dawning comprehension. Cassie felt the blood drain from her face as she recognized exactly what her brother had created. Oh no. Her mother's cheerful expression morphed into a stern frown. "Young man," she called out, spotting Toby crouched behind a stack of boxes. "I don't know what you think you're doing, but that is entirely inappropriate." Toby howled with laughter, pointing at their horrified faces. "You should see yourselves. You look like someone stuck a candy cane where the sun don't." "That's it." Cassie launched herself across the room, knocking over an empty decoration box in her pursuit. Toby squealed and tried to scramble away, but she managed to grab the back of his sweater. "The shells!" he yelped, holding up her precious garlands like a peace offering. "They're fine. I didn't hurt them." "Oh, you are so dead!" Cassie snatched the garlands with one hand while trying to get him in a headlock with the other. In their scuffle, they bumped into the tree, sending the flamingo flying. Ethan caught it reflexively. "Nice save," Toby called out, then immediately regretted drawing attention to himself as Cassie used his distraction to her advantage. "Children!" Their mother's voice cut through the chaos. "This is not appropriate behavior for." She had to jump back as Toby broke free, sending a box of tinsel exploding across the floor like silvery shrapnel. "Sorry, Mom," Cassie called out, already in pursuit as Toby grabbed a handful of artificial snow. "I'll clean it up as soon as I murder my brother." "You'll never take me alive," Toby declared, throwing the fake snow over his shoulder. It caught in Cassie's hair, making her look like she'd aged 50 years in 5 seconds. "My decorations!" she shrieked, grabbing her own ammunition. A roll of ribbon that went spinning through the air like a festive missile. Ethan pressed himself against the wall, clutching the rescued flamingo to his chest as the siblings circled the room. "Should we stop them?" he asked Mrs. Harper uncertainly. But Jillian Harper just sighed, a sound of long-suffering maternal resignation. "Sometimes it's best to let them wear themselves out." She paused as Toby used a wreath as a shield against another ribbon assault, though perhaps we should save the breakable ornaments while we can. Cassie shoved her still cackling brother through the lighthouse door, her face flushed with a mixture of exertion and embarrassment. "That's it. You're officially banned from the lighthouse." She slammed the door on Toby's gleeful expression, pressing her back against it as if he might try to force his way back in. The interior of the lighthouse looked like Christmas had exploded, tinsel draped haphazardly across every surface. The crude light display still blinked its inappropriate message, and somehow, she wasn't even sure how, fake snow covered nearly every horizontal surface. Her carefully crafted nautical theme had been transformed into what looked like Santa's workshop after a hurricane. "I'm so sorry about him," Cassie said, turning to Ethan with an embarrassed grimace. Her hands fluttered uselessly over the mess, not sure where to even begin. "Toby's been a total terror lately. I don't know what's gotten into him." To her surprise, Ethan just shrugged. He'd already moved to the tangled mass of Christmas lights, his long fingers working methodically to separate the strands. "Don't worry about it. Little brothers, right?" Cassie blinked, caught off guard by the hint of amusement in his green eyes. This was not the reaction she'd expected from Mr. Bow, practical and serious. She watched, dumbfounded, as he continued unknotting the lights with surprising efficiency. Once he had the strands separated, Ethan began winding them up the spiral staircase. His movements were precise and measured, creating an elegant swirl that transformed the utilitarian steps into something almost magical. "Here, hand me those shells," he said, nodding toward the pile of decorations Toby had unceremoniously dumped earlier. "We can recycle them." Fighting back a smile, Cassie gathered up her scattered creations. She passed them to him one by one, watching as he wove them expertly through the light strands. His hands moved with surprising grace for someone who'd seemed so dismissive of decorating earlier. "A little higher," he murmured, reaching down from his perch on the stairs. Their fingers brushed as she handed him another shell, and Cassie felt a little jolt that had nothing to do with static electricity. Within minutes, the staircase had been transformed. The lights twinkled through the iridescent shells, creating patterns that danced across the lighthouse walls like underwater reflections. Each shell caught and amplified the glow, turning the simple spiral staircase into something that belonged in a mermaid's palace. "Wow!" Cassie breathed, tilting her head back to take in the full effect. The light play was mesmerizing, better than anything she could have planned. How did you do that so fast? Ethan descended the stairs, brushing his hands off on his jeans. He ducked his head, a gesture that seemed almost shy. Guess I'm just handy. You had the creativity. I just put it into motion. Their eyes met, and Cassie felt warmth bloom in her chest that had nothing to do with the twinkling lights surrounding them. She hesitated, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. We make a pretty good team. The corner of Ethan's mouth quirked up in a half smile that transformed his whole face. The lights cast shifting patterns across his features, softening his usually serious expression. For a moment, neither of them spoke, letting the gentle twinkle of the lights fill the comfortable silence. Cassie found herself noticing little details she hadn't before. The way his dark hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, how his green eyes caught the golden glow of the lights, the small scatter of freckles across the bridge of his nose that you could only see up close. A loud bang from outside made them both jump. Toby's voice filtered through the door, singing an off-key version of Deck the Halls with deliberately mangled lyrics. Deck the halls with rubber chickens, fa-la-la-la-la-la-la, splat! Cassie groaned, pressing her hands to her burning cheeks. I should probably go make sure he's not planning any more surprises. Probably wise, Ethan agreed, but he was still smiling that small, secret smile. Though I have to admit, the kid's got style. Not many people would think to put a hula girl on a Christmas tree. Don't encourage him, Cassie warned, but she was fighting back a grin of her own. Next thing you know, he'll be replacing all the ornaments with plastic lobsters wearing Santa hats. Now there's an idea. Don't you dare! But she was laughing now, the earlier mortification fading in the face of Ethan's unexpected playfulness. Chapter 5. Christmas Light Chaos. The morning sun cast long shadows across the lighthouse grounds as Ethan squinted up at Cassie's precarious position on the slanted roof. His stomach did an uncomfortable flip as she inched her way higher, a tangled mass of icicle lights clutched in one hand. You sure you want to be up there? He tried to keep his voice casual, but concern crept in despite his best efforts. The shingles looked slick with morning dew, and the angle was steeper than he'd realized from below. Cassie's ponytail swung as she waved dismissively in his direction. Relax, I've got great balance. She adjusted her grip on the lights, moving with the confident grace of someone used to navigating surfboards. This is nothing compared to catching waves during storm season. The universe, apparently eager to prove her wrong, chose that exact moment to intervene. Her right foot slid on a damp shingle, and suddenly she was pinwheeling her arms, the bundle of lights flailing wildly. Ethan's heart leaped into his throat as he instinctively moved closer to the building, muscles tensed to spring into action. But Cassie somehow managed to right herself, letting out a breathless laugh that carried down to where he stood. See? Totally fine. Her voice was slightly higher than usual, betraying the adrenaline rush of her near slip. Ethan shook his head, forcing himself to look away from her death-defying decorating attempts. He focused instead on the chaos of lights at his feet, trying to find some logic in the twisted mess. Who had packed these things away last year? It looked like they'd been stored by a vindictive octopus. Above him, he could hear Cassie's careful movements as she navigated along the roof's peak. She'd found an old pole in the lighthouse storage, probably some ancient cleaning tool, and was using it to drape the lights over the curved edge of the roof. The morning light caught in her hair, turning it to spun gold against the weathered white of the lighthouse. A little more to the left, he called up, noticing a gap in the arrangement. The lights needed to hang evenly if they were going to achieve the icicle effect she'd envisioned. Cassie stretched out, leaning at an angle that made Ethan's palms sweat. She was so focused on adjusting the strand that she didn't notice the other end working loose from its temporary anchor. Ethan spotted the slipping lights just as they broke free completely. He jumped backward, narrowly avoiding the cascade of lights and bulbs that clattered onto the ground where he'd been standing seconds before. The sound of breaking glass made him wince. There went at least a dozen bulbs. Cassie! He looked up, exasperation warring with concern. She peered down at him with a grimace that was equal parts embarrassment and apology, her cheeks flushed pink in the morning sun. She offered a sheepish thumbs up, and Ethan found himself chuckling despite the chaos. He crouched down to assess the damage, carefully gathering the snarled strands. "You know," he called up, "when my parents talked about brightening up the place, I don't think this is what they had in mind." "Ha ha," Cassie deadpanned, but he could hear the smile in her voice. "Just wait until you see it all lit up. It's going to look amazing." Ethan began rewinding the salvageable portions of lights, stealing glances up at Cassie as she continued her rooftop mission. Her determination was something else. He had to give her that. Most people would have given up after the first near disaster, but here she was, practically dancing across the roof like some kind of Christmas-obsessed mountain goat. The morning breeze carried the salt tang of the ocean, mixing with the woody scent of the old lighthouse timber. Seagulls wheeled overhead, probably wondering what these strange humans were doing to their usual perch. One particularly bold bird swooped close to Cassie, making her duck with a surprised squeak. "Hey," she waved the pole at it. "This is a no-landing zone, buddy. We're doing renovations." "Great," Ethan muttered. "Now you're antagonizing the wildlife." But he was smiling as he said it, surprising himself with how natural it felt. When had he started actually enjoying these decoration sessions? He watched as Cassie secured another strand of lights, her movements more careful now after the earlier slip. She had a way of attacking problems head-on that both terrified and impressed him. It was so different from his own measured approach to everything. The sun climbed higher as they worked, warming the cool morning air. Ethan had long since shed his jacket, and Cassie's cheeks were pink with exertion. But slowly, steadily, the lighthouse was transforming. Even unlit, the carefully arranged strands promised something magical once darkness fell. "Just one more section," Cassie announced, shuffling sideways along the roof's peak. "Then we can test them out." "Assuming any of the bulbs survived their suicide dive," Ethan replied, but he was already mentally calculating how many replacement lights they'd need. Something about Cassie's enthusiasm made him want to see this project succeed, despite his initial skepticism. A gentle clatter of shells drew his attention to where their earlier handiwork caught the sunlight through the lighthouse windows. The staircase decorations still danced with reflected light, creating patterns that seemed to shift and flow like underwater currents. Maybe Cassie's vision for the place wasn't so impractical after all. Cassie dropped down onto the weathered bench beside Ethan, her legs grateful for the reprieve. Grabbing her water bottle from her backpack, she took several long gulps, relishing the cool relief. The morning's work had left her hair plastered to her forehead, and her arms ached from wrestling with the endless strands of lights. Whew! She wiped her brow with the back of her hand, feeling the salt of dried sweat. Who knew hanging lights could be such a workout? I should add extreme decorating to my resume. Ethan's lips quirked up at the corners as he glanced her way. "You're the one who insisted on scaling the actual roof instead of using ladders like a normal person." He gestured to the perfectly good ladder they'd propped against the lighthouse wall, the one she'd barely touched. Cassie made a face at him but couldn't argue. The ladder would have been safer, sure, but something about climbing up there herself had felt right. More personal, somehow. Her gaze drifted upward, taking in the lighthouse's weathered facade. The strings of unlit bulbs traced its edges like delicate lace, waiting for darkness to spring to life. Extended between them, Cassie fidgeted with her water bottle cap, turning it over and over in her fingers. "Can I admit something?" The words slipped out before she could stop them. Ethan turned toward her, one eyebrow arching in curiosity. His expression held none of its usual skepticism, just genuine interest that caused her chest to tighten unexpectedly. Cassie hugged her knees to her chest and exhaled deeply. "Sometimes I wonder if I've bitten off more than I can chew. With all of this, I mean." She gestured vaguely at the lighthouse and its half-finished decorations. When Ethan remained quiet, she found herself continuing, the words tumbling out like water through a broken dam. "Ever since I was a kid, everyone's called me Miss Holiday Cheer, the town sweetheart who makes Christmas magical." She gave a soft, self-deprecating laugh. "My mom still tells the story about how I organized a Christmas Carol flash mob when I was 9. Her fingers found a loose thread on her cutoffs, picking at it absently. But the older I get, the more that title feels like, I don't know, pressure? An expectation to be perfect. The thread came loose in her hand and she wrapped it around her finger until it left a tiny red mark. Last year, Mrs. Peterson actually cried when I helped decorate the community center. Cried! And then she told everyone at church that I was keeping the spirit of Christmas alive in Seaview Shores. Cassie's shoulders slumped. What if I'm not as merry and bright as everyone thinks? What if I disappoint them? The admission hung in the air between them, heavier than all the Christmas lights they'd hung that morning. Cassie kept her eyes fixed on her hands, afraid to look up and see judgment, or worse, pity, in Ethan's expression. The silence stretched so long she began to regret saying anything at all. Finally, Ethan shifted beside her. For what it's worth, he paused, seeming to choose his words with careful deliberation. I think all that holiday cheer stuff is overrated anyway. Cassie's head snapped up, eyes wide. Of all the responses she'd expected, that hadn't been one of them. Ethan met her startled gaze with a lopsided smile that transformed his usually serious face into something softer, more approachable. The way I see it, you're working pretty hard to make this place amazing. That's impressive enough. He gestured at the lighthouse. You scaled a roof today, Harper. Without safety gear, I might add, which was completely reckless and definitely not something we should mention to my parents. His words carried no judgment, just a simple statement of fact that somehow made Cassie's chest feel lighter than it had in weeks. She looked at him, really looked at him, noticing how the morning light caught the green flecks in his eyes, how his usual stern expression had mellowed into something that looked almost like understanding. Besides, he continued, anyone who expects you to be some kind of Christmas fairy godmother 24/7 clearly hasn't spent enough time actually getting to know you. What's that supposed to mean? Cassie asked, but there was no heat in her words. It means you're human, Harper. You get sweaty hanging lights, you curse under your breath when you stub your toe. Yes, I heard that earlier, and sometimes you probably want to throw tinsel at people who annoy you. He paused, then added with a hint of his usual dry humor, I assume I'm at the top of that list. A laugh bubbled up from somewhere deep in Cassie's chest, surprising them both. Only on days ending in Y, she retorted, feeling some of her usual spark return. Cassie considered Ethan's words, a small smile tugging at her lips despite her best efforts to maintain her vulnerable moment. The salty breeze ruffled her ponytail as she wrestled with the weight of his reassurance. You really think so? That it's enough? More than. Ethan's response came without hesitation, catching her off guard. When she glanced up, he held her gaze with an intensity she hadn't seen before, his green eyes steady and certain in a way that made her stomach do a tiny flip. You've got serious dedication, Harper. Not everyone would scale a lighthouse in flip-flops. The waves crashed against the shore below them, filling the comfortable silence that settled between them. Seagulls wheeled overhead, their distant cries mingling with the rhythmic sound of the surf. Cassie found herself studying the way the morning light played across the weathered boards of the lighthouse deck, how it caught the salt spray in the air and turned it to diamond dust. The tension in her shoulders began to ease, replaced by something lighter, warmer, like the first sip of hot chocolate on a cold morning. Ethan cleared his throat, drawing her attention back to him. He looked almost nervous, fingers drumming an uneven pattern against his knee, his usual confidence wavering at the edges. Can I admit something too? About why I've been such a Grinch lately? Cassie's eyes widened at the unexpected offer, her heart picking up speed. She nodded, watching as he raked a hand through his already tousled dark hair, making it stick up even more than usual. A lock fell across his forehead, and she fought the sudden urge to brush it back. I'm really not used to. He gestured vaguely at their surroundings. The quirky lighthouse, with its peeling paint and character, the small beach town spread out below them like a postcard come to life, complete with tinsel-wrapped palm trees and surfboards propped against candy cane-striped posts. All this. The breeze carried the scent of salt and distant pine trees, an odd combination that somehow worked perfectly, just like so many things in Seaview Shores. Cassie waited, sensing there was more to his story. watching the way his shoulders tensed and relaxed as he gathered his thoughts. Where I'm from, we didn't make a big fuss over holidays. His voice grew quieter, almost lost in the sound of the waves and the distant echo of Christmas music from the boardwalk below. It was just another day, you know. Mom worked extra shifts at the hospital. Dad was always traveling for business. Sometimes we'd order Chinese food and watch whatever was on TV. Something in his tone made Cassie's chest tighten. She could picture it so clearly. A younger Ethan in some sleek city apartment, watching Christmas specials alone while outside the world rushed by, indifferent to the season. The image made her want to reach out, to somehow share all the warmth and joy she'd always known during the holidays. I'll be honest, he continued, his mouth twisting into a wry smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. When we first got here, I kind of hated it. The decorations, the forced cheer, it all seemed so cheesy. Like everyone was trying too hard to create this perfect holiday moment. His hands stilled their nervous movement, and he met her gaze again. The morning sun caught the green in his eyes, making them shine with an unexpected warmth that reminded her of sea glass polished smooth by the waves. But the more time I spend with you, the more I get it. Why this place is so special. Warmth bloomed in Cassie's cheeks, spreading down her neck like sunrise over the ocean, and she found herself holding her breath. The way he was looking at her, it wasn't the usual exasperated glance or skeptical stare. There was something else there. Something that made her heart skip and her thoughts scatter like seabirds in the wind. Before she could gather those thoughts into anything resembling a coherent response, Ethan stood abruptly, the old boards creaking beneath his feet. He brushed off his jeans and extended a hand toward her, his shy smile transforming his usually serious face into something that made her pulse stumble. Come on, we've got work to do, holiday cheer. His hand felt warm and solid against hers as he helped her up, calloused from the renovation work, but gentle in its grip. And for a moment, they stood there, connected by that simple touch. The nickname that had felt like a burden earlier now carried a different weight, something closer to affection than expectation, like a treasured ornament that had finally found its perfect spot on the tree. Cassie found herself wondering if maybe, just maybe, there was room in Seaview Shores for both of their perspectives. Her enthusiastic embrace of tradition and his careful skepticism, her creative chaos and his practical approach. Like the ocean meeting the shore, sometimes the most interesting things happened at the edges where two different worlds collided, creating something entirely new and unexpectedly beautiful. The thought made her smile, and this time, she didn't try to hide it. Instead, she gave his hand a quick squeeze before letting go, savoring the lingering warmth of his touch. Well then, Mr. Grinch, let's see if we can't make this lighthouse shine bright enough to guide Santa's sleigh. Chapter 6. The Rivals Reveal. Ethan stopped dead in his tracks at the edge of Main Street, his jaw dropping slightly. You've got to be kidding me. The entire downtown of Seaview Shores had transformed overnight into what could only be described as Christmas exploding onto every conceivable surface. Twinkling lights draped between palm trees created a canopy of starlight above the street. Garlands wrapped every lamppost, mailbox, and storefront. Even the bike racks sported festive bows. Isn't it amazing? Cassie beamed, her hazel eyes reflecting the sparkle of 1,000 tiny bulbs. Before Ethan could voice his very different opinion, she looped her arm through his and practically yanked him toward the town square. The annual Christmas market had taken over the space, filling it with rows of wooden booths and the mingled scents of cinnamon, pine, and salt air. Whoa, wait. He dug his heels in as they approached the bustling square, but Cassie's momentum was unstoppable. Everywhere he looked, vendors hawked their wares. Hand-painted ornaments, steaming cups of hot chocolate, gingerbread cookies decorated to look like surfboards. A steel drum band played Jingle Bells with a Caribbean twist, while children darted between booths, trailing ribbons and laughter. This is exactly the kind of thing I was talking about, he muttered, cringing as they passed a group of carolers in matching Santa hats and Hawaiian shirts. Their enthusiastic rendition of Deck the Halls seemed to follow them through the crowd. Excuse me, coming through. Cassie navigated the packed marketplace like a pro, offering bright smiles and cheerful greetings to what seemed like every single person they passed. "Hi, Mrs. Rodriguez. Love the new booth setup, Mr. Chen. Those wreaths look amazing, Katie." Ethan hunched his shoulders, trying to make himself smaller as the crowd pressed in around them. The sheer number of people, all radiating aggressive holiday cheer, made his skin prickle. He shoved his hands deep into his pockets, wishing he could disappear into his jacket. "Free candy cane for the young man?" A vendor with a Santa beard and tropical shirt suddenly thrust a striped treat toward Ethan's face. He jerked back so quickly he nearly knocked over a display of shell ornaments. "Would you relax?" Cassie laughed, smoothly catching the candy cane before it could fall. Her eyes danced with amusement as she unwrapped it. "This is supposed to be fun." She popped the candy between her lips, the red and white stripes making her grin look even more mischievous. Ethan scowled, but found his gaze lingering on the way she twirled the candy cane with practiced ease. Shaking his head to clear it, he followed as she forged ahead through the crowd. He stayed half a step behind, using her as a buffer between himself and the overwhelming festivity surrounding them. She finally stopped at a booth overflowing with handcrafted decorations. Delicate glass balls painted with beach scenes, driftwood reindeer, and strings of shells transformed into garland. "Cassie, sweetheart?" The elderly woman behind the counter reached across to clasp Cassie's free hand. Her husband, equally silver-haired and wearing a sweater decorated with surfing penguins, beamed at them. "We were hoping you'd stop by today. Looking for anything special this year, dear?" the woman asked, already reaching for a box beneath the counter. "We've got some new designs we thought might catch your eye." Ethan hung back as Cassie leaned in, immediately engaged in animated discussion about color schemes and coastal themes. He watched the easy way she chatted with the couple, how naturally she fit into this tight-knit community. Everyone here seemed to know her, to genuinely light up when they saw her approach. The weight of his outsider status pressed down on his shoulders like a physical thing. He didn't know the secret handshake, didn't speak the language of small-town familiarity. In the city, anonymity had been a comfort. Here, it felt like a wall between him and, well, everything. Everyone. His gaze drifted to Cassie as she laughed at something the old man said, her whole face lighting up brighter than any of the decorations surrounding them. She looked so at home here, so perfectly in her element. Meanwhile, he felt about as natural as a penguin in the desert, and not the cheerful sweater variety either. The elderly woman caught him watching and winked, making his cheeks heat. He quickly pretended to be fascinated by a display of seashell angels, but he could still feel her knowing smile boring into the side of his head. "Oh, these are perfect!" Cassie's exclamation drew his attention back. She held up what looked like a miniature lighthouse, its tiny windows glowing with warm light. Wrapped around its base were delicate strands of pearls and tiny starfish, making it seem as though the ocean itself had decorated it. Something in his chest tightened at the pure joy in her expression. For just a moment, he could almost see the magic through her eyes, not as forced cheer or overwhelming chaos, but as genuine warmth and connection, as creativity and care crafted into something beautiful. Almost. Cassie's eyes sparkled as she leaned over the vendor's table, completely in her element among the glittering ornaments and holiday crafts. "These shell garlands are stunning, and oh my gosh, is that a seahorse wearing a Santa hat?" Mrs. Bennett, the elderly vendor, chuckled warmly. "I knew you'd appreciate that one, dear." Tom spent hours getting the expression just right. "It's perfect for the lighthouse display." Cassie picked up the whimsical ornament, already envisioning where it would hang. "Don't you think so, Ethan?" When no response came, she glanced over her shoulder. Ethan stood a few steps back, hands still shoved in his pockets, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. But just as she opened her mouth to coax him closer, something changed in his expression. His gaze fixed on a point just past her shoulder, and for the first time since she'd met him, his carefully maintained mask of indifference slipped. Moving with unusual care, Ethan approached the table. His hand emerged from his pocket, reaching out to lift a glass ornament from its velvet nest. The sphere caught the winter sunlight, sending prismatic patterns dancing across his face as he turned it in his hands. Ethan's breath caught audibly as the design came into full view. A delicate hummingbird captured mid-flight, its wings spread in an eternal moment of grace. Mr. Bennet's weathered face creased in a knowing smile. You've got a good eye, son. That's based on an antique pattern. Not many folks appreciate the classical designs anymore. Cassie found herself holding her breath, afraid to break whatever spell had transformed Ethan's usually stern features into something softer, almost vulnerable. His thumb traced the bird's outline with such gentleness it made her heart ache. My grandmother. Ethan's voice came out rough, and he had to clear his throat before continuing. She used to make pieces like this. Stained glass was her passion. His eyes remained fixed on the ornament, but Cassie could tell he was seeing something far away and long ago. She'd let me sit in her workshop for hours, watching her work. The way she'd choose just the right pieces, grinding the edges until they fit perfectly. The usual sharp edges of his personality had melted away, leaving behind something raw and real. When he finally looked up at Mr. Bennet, his green eyes held an almost boyish uncertainty. Would you mind if I? Mr. Bennet reached across the table to pat Ethan's hand. It's yours, son. No charge. That's what the season's all about, isn't it? Keeping memories alive and passing them on. Ethan's throat worked as he swallowed hard. With the same care he might use handling a butterfly's wing, he wrapped the ornament in tissue paper and tucked it into his jacket pocket. His hand lingered there, as if reassuring himself of its presence. The moment felt too private for words, but Cassie couldn't help reaching out to squeeze his arm gently. The gesture was brief. Anything more would have broken the spell. But when Ethan's eyes met hers, something had shifted. Behind his usual guardedness, she caught a glimpse of joy so pure it took her breath away. It was like watching a door crack open, letting in a shaft of light that hinted at hidden depths she'd never suspected. Mrs. Bennet busied herself reorganizing ornaments, giving them a moment of privacy. You know, she said casually, Tom's workshop is just behind the booth. He's always happy to share techniques with anyone interested in the craft. Ethan's hand drifted back to his pocket, fingers curling protectively around his treasure. I'd like that. Maybe sometime. The words came out quiet but sincere, and Cassie felt a warm glow in her chest. She dragged him to the market, hoping to spark some holiday spirit, but this was something deeper. This wasn't about Christmas at all. It was about connection, about the threads that tied past to present and stranger to friend. Mr. Bennet nodded, understanding flowing between them. Anytime, son. We're here every weekend through the season. As they stepped away from the booth, Cassie noticed Ethan's shoulders had lost some of their tension. He moved more easily through the crowd, no longer trying to make himself invisible. Every few steps, his hand would drift to his pocket, checking on his precious cargo. She wanted to ask about his grandmother, to learn more about the boy who'd sat mesmerized by colored glass and careful craftsmanship. But she held her tongue, recognizing that some gifts needed to be unwrapped slowly, in their own time. Instead, she pointed to a booth selling hot chocolate topped with candy cane whipped cream. Want to grab a drink? I promise it's better than that candy cane you dodged earlier. The corner of Ethan's mouth twitched up. Not quite a smile, but closer than she'd seen before. Yeah, he said softly. I'd like that. The evening air wrapped around them like a cozy blanket as Cassie and Ethan meandered away from the Christmas market. Behind them, strands of twinkling lights transformed the boardwalk into a fairyland, their glow softened by the gathering dusk. The lighthouse beckoned in the distance, its familiar silhouette a constant guardian against the darkening sky. Cassie nursed the remains of her hot chocolate, stealing glances at her companion between sips. Every few steps, Ethan's hand drifted to his jacket pocket, fingers brushing the tissue-wrapped ornament with a tenderness that made her chest tight. His face had settled into an expression she'd never seen before, thoughtful and open, missing its usual sharp edges. You know, she ventured, swirling the dregs of whipped cream in her cup. I don't think I've ever seen you so. The word danced just out of reach until she caught it. Soft? Before today, I mean. Ethan's brow furrowed, the familiar crease appearing between his eyes. But instead of the defensive snap she'd grown used to, his voice held only mild curiosity. What's that supposed to mean? A laugh bubbled up before she could stop it. "Oh, come on." She gestured with her empty cup. You have to admit, the whole brooding loner thing was getting a little predictable. Color crept across his cheeks, visible even in the fading light. Instead of arguing, he offered a half shrug that spoke volumes. His fingers found the pocket again, tracing the shape of the ornament through the fabric. "I guess I'm just not used to people seeing that side of me." The admission came out quiet, almost lost in the sound of distant carolers, especially not around the holidays. Something in his tone made Cassie's heart squeeze. A note of old hurt or loss she couldn't quite place. But before she could find the right words to ask, Ethan surprised her by bumping his shoulder against hers, the gesture playful despite its awkwardness. "But hey, you're doing a pretty good job of making me embrace my inner elf so far," holiday cheer. The nickname that had started as a jab now carried a warmth that caught her completely off guard. When she looked up, the fondness in his green eyes made her breath catch. Gone was the annoyed boy who'd dismissed her decorating plans as frivolous. In his place stood someone far more interesting, someone who could lose himself in the beauty of blown glass and carry memories so carefully in his pocket. Their footsteps fell into an easy rhythm as they walked, matching the distant percussion of waves against the shore. The silence between them felt different now, comfortable rather than charged. It struck Cassie that maybe they'd both been guilty of seeing what they expected to see. She'd written him off as the grumpy new kid, while he'd dismissed her as the town's relentlessly cheerful holiday mascot. The truth, as always, was far more complicated and far more interesting. The tissue paper crinkled softly as Ethan's hand found his pocket once more. This time, though, he didn't just touch the ornament. He drew it out carefully, unwrapping it with reverent fingers. In the mix of starlight and distant Christmas lights, the hummingbird seemed to come alive, its wings catching and scattering light in all directions. "My grandmother would have loved this place," he said suddenly, his voice rough with emotion. "All the lights, the ocean. She always said beauty should be everywhere, not just hanging on a tree." His thumb traced the bird's delicate wing. "She would have decorated every inch of that lighthouse, inside and out." Cassie watched his face as he spoke, struck by how the simple act of remembering transformed his features. The guardrails were down, letting her see glimpses of the boy who'd spent hours watching an artist at work, learning to see beauty in unexpected places. "She sounds amazing," she offered softly. "She was." Ethan carefully rewrapped the ornament, but his expression remained open. "Still is, I guess, even though she's gone. Some people just leave their mark on the world. You know?" The words settled between them like a shared secret. Cassie thought about her own family traditions, about the way her mother's hands moved when she wrapped presents, about the stories behind every ornament on their tree. Some things, she realized, went deeper than mere decoration. They were nearly at the lighthouse now, its weathered walls painted in shades of silver and shadow by the rising moon. The renovations had stripped away years of neglect. But tonight, Cassie saw it through new eyes, not just as a building to be decorated, but as a canvas waiting for stories of its own. "Maybe that's what all this is really about," she mused aloud. "Not just making things pretty, but making memories, leaving our mark, even if it's just in small ways." Ethan's step faltered slightly, and when she glanced up, she found him looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. The moonlight caught in his dark hair, turning the edges to silver, and for a moment he seemed younger somehow, more like the boy who'd sat in his grandmother's workshop, less like the carefully constructed facade he showed the world. "Small ways," he repeated softly, as if testing the weight of the words. "Yeah, maybe you're right." Chapter 7. Stormy Setback. The first rumble of thunder caught Cassie off guard. She froze mid-reach, tinsel dangling from her fingers as she turned toward the ocean. Dark clouds had begun rolling in, transforming the crisp December afternoon into something more ominous. The cheerful winter sun disappeared behind the approaching wall of gray, casting strange shadows across the lighthouse grounds. "That's weird," she muttered, squinting at the threatening sky. "I didn't think rain was in the forecast." The weather report had promised clear skies, perfect for their outdoor decorating session. They'd specifically chosen today because of it. A brilliant flash of lightning split the sky, followed immediately by a deafening crack that made her yelp and jump backward. The first fat raindrops splattered against her upturned face, cold and shocking against her skin. Panic seized her chest as she looked at their afternoon's work spread out across the lighthouse lawn. Delicate handmade ornaments, strings of electrical lights, and carefully crafted displays, all vulnerable to the sudden deluge. "Ethan?" she called out, her voice tight with urgency. "We need to get everything inside now." He appeared from around the corner, already moving with purpose. They dove for the nearest decorations, Cassie shrugging off her jacket to wrap it protectively around a box of glass ornaments. The rain intensified with shocking speed, turning from scattered drops to sheets of water that made it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. "Got the lights!" Ethan shouted over the downpour, struggling with the long strands of icicle lights they'd just finished hanging. A powerful gust of wind caught the strings, whipping them sideways like glittering snakes. He grunted, nearly losing his grip as another gust threatened to tear them from his hands entirely. Cassie clutched her own armful of decorations closer, trying to shield them with her body as she made a dash for the cottage door. The wind drove the rain sideways, soaking through her clothes in seconds. Her feet slipped on the wet grass, and she barely managed to keep her balance without dropping anything. They stumbled through the cottage door one after another, dripping all over the floor and panting from the effort. Cassie's hands shook as she carefully set down her burden, dreading what she'd find as she began unwrapping the soaked jacket from around the box. Her heart sank. Water had seeped through despite her best efforts, leaving the ornaments in various states of ruin. Delicate paper decorations had dissolved into colorful pulp. The hand-painted shells they'd collected were chipped and cracking. Even the more sturdy pieces hadn't escaped damage. "No, no, no." The words came out as barely more than a whisper as she lifted one of her favorite pieces, a glass ball filled with local sand and shells, decorated with tiny painted waves. A crack ran through one side, leaking a trail of glitter and sand across her palm. Each grain that slipped through her fingers felt like a piece of her heart falling away. She could feel Ethan's presence behind her, hovering uncertainly. An uncomfortable quiet hung between them, broken only by the steady drumming of rain against the cottage roof and the occasional rumble of thunder. She knew she should say something. Make a joke. Find the silver lining. Be the eternally optimistic Cassie Harper everyone expected. But she couldn't. Not this time. This project was supposed to be different. After their talk at the Christmas market, after seeing how Ethan connected with that hummingbird ornament, she'd thought maybe she'd finally found someone who could understand. Someone who could see past the surface sparkle to the heart beneath, the stories and memories woven into each carefully crafted piece. Now half their decorations lay ruined, and with them that tentative bridge of understanding she'd hoped to build. Her shoulders slumped as she set the broken ornament aside, unable to look at it anymore. The familiar pressure of tears built behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She was Cassie Harper, after all, Miss Holiday Cheer, the girl who could find joy in anything. Except right now, with rain hammering against the windows and their afternoon's work destroyed, even her seemingly boundless holiday spirit felt as dim as the storm-darkened sky outside. The cottage seemed smaller somehow, crowded with their silence and the pile of ruined decorations between them. Water dripped steadily from their clothes, forming puddles on the old wooden floor. Another crack of thunder shook the windows, and Cassie jumped slightly, still holding the empty ornament shell in her hands. She forced herself to set it down gently rather than crush it in frustration. The glass made a hollow sound as it touched the table, like the last note of a song cut short. Behind her, she heard Ethan shift his weight, floorboards creaking beneath his feet, still waiting, still watching, still not speaking. Maybe that was worse than any attempt at comfort, this heavy silence that left her alone with her thoughts, with the evidence of her failure spread out before her like pieces of a shattered dream. Thunder rumbled outside the cottage as Cassie stared at the pile of sodden decorations. Each drip of water from their clothes onto the wooden floor seemed to echo in the heavy silence. The storm's fury pressed against the windows, a fitting backdrop to the devastation before her. Her fingers traced the edge of a waterlogged paper star, watching it dissolve at her touch. All those hours of careful crafting reduced to a pile of wet debris. The lighthouse's first Christmas was supposed to be perfect, magical even. Instead, well, Ethan cleared his throat, making her jump. I guess we know where not to put the outdoor stuff next time. Cassie's head snapped up. Was that actually an attempt at humor from Ethan Carter? The same guy who'd spent weeks rolling his eyes at every festive suggestion? She studied his face, trying to determine if she'd imagined it. He shifted uncomfortably under her gaze, rubbing the back of his neck. Look, I know how much work you put into all this, but what? The words came out sharper than she'd intended, defensive walls snapping back into place. It's all trashed anyway, so why bother? Her voice cracked on the last word, and she hated how vulnerable it made her sound. To her surprise, Ethan shook his head firmly. Not everything. Before she could protest, he knelt beside the scattered decorations, his expression unexpectedly focused as he began sorting through them. Here, this one just needs to dry out. He carefully lifted a shell ornament from the wreckage. The ribbon was soaked, but the shell itself remained intact, its painted surface still gleaming. He placed it gently aside, already reaching for the next piece. Cassie watched, dumbfounded, as Ethan methodically evaluated each decoration. His hands, usually so awkward around the delicate ornaments, moved with surprising gentleness now. He separated them into neat piles, salvageable, fixable, and beyond repair, muttering quiet observations as he worked. The paint might need touching up on these. That crack could be sealed. The paper ones are gone, but we could remake them stronger. Something shifted in her chest as she watched him. This wasn't the reluctant participant who'd treated the whole project like an inconvenience. This was someone who saw solutions instead of problems, who handled each piece like it mattered, like her work mattered. A particularly loud crack of thunder made them both jump, but Ethan barely paused in his sorting. He held up another ornament, a small driftwood star she'd wrapped with twine and tiny shells. The twine got wet, but once it dries, we can reinforce it. Maybe add a coating to protect it next time. Next time. The words hung in the air between them, full of possibility. Without conscious thought, Cassie found herself kneeling beside him. Their shoulders brushed as she reached for a partially damaged wreath, and neither pulled away. The base is still good, she said softly. We could replace the damaged pieces with some of those extra shells we found last week. Ethan nodded, already making space in his fixable pile. They fell into an easy rhythm, working side by side as the storm raged outside. The silence between them had transformed from heavy to comfortable, broken only by quiet suggestions and the occasional murmur of agreement. As they worked, Cassie couldn't help stealing glances at her unexpected ally. His dark hair was still damp from the rain, curling slightly at the ends. His expression held none of its usual guardedness. Instead, there was a focus that reminded her of the way he'd looked at his grandmother's hummingbird ornament in the market. He caught her looking and paused, a question in his eyes. What? Nothing, she said quickly, turning back to the decorations. But a small smile tugged at her lips as she rescued another shell from the pile. The storm still howled outside, but somehow it didn't seem quite so devastating anymore. Together, they created order from chaos. The pile of salvageable decorations grew steadily, each rescued piece a small victory. When Ethan carefully extracted an intricate sand dollar ornament she'd thought was surely ruined, Cassie felt a spark of her usual optimism returning. Maybe this wasn't the end of her vision for the lighthouse's first Christmas. Maybe, like these decorations, it just needed some careful attention and a willingness to see past the damage to the potential underneath. The rain drummed against the windows, but inside the cottage, something new was taking shape. Not just in the growing collection of saved decorations, but in the way they worked together, moving around each other with an ease that would have seemed impossible just hours ago. The steady drumming of rain against the lighthouse windows created a soothing rhythm as Cassie and Ethan worked. Their movements had fallen into an easy synchronization, She would carefully extract an ornament from the wreckage while he assessed the damage, or he would hold up a piece for her inspection as they sorted through their holiday casualties. The initial panic that had seized her chest when the storm hit had mellowed into something more manageable. Each salvaged decoration felt like a small victory, and Cassie found herself drawing comfort from Ethan's methodical approach. He handled each piece with surprising care, those same hands that had once seemed so clumsy with her creations, now moving with deliberate gentleness. Ethan straightened up from where he'd been crouched over a particularly tangled string of lights, pushing his rain-dampened hair away from his forehead. "Not as bad as I thought," he said, surveying their organized piles. "Yeah, I may have overreacted a bit," Cassie started, but Ethan's expression suddenly shifted, his eyes taking on that intense focus she was beginning to recognize. "What if we leaned into it?" he interrupted, gaze sweeping across their disheveled workspace. Cassie blinked, caught off guard by his sudden enthusiasm. "Leaned into what? You mean the storm?" "Exactly." The words tumbled out faster now, animated in a way she'd never seen from him before. "Think about it. Storms are part of living by the ocean, right? They're not just something to work around. They're part of what makes this place what it is." Before she could respond, he'd scooped up a handful of broken shells and sand from where the wind had blown them inside. The mixture sifted through his fingers, catching what little light filtered through the storm clouds. "We could incorporate that moody coastal vibe. Instead of fighting against it, we work with it." His enthusiasm was infectious, and Cassie found herself leaning forward as he continued. "Picture it. We could create these amazing driftwood sculptures, position them so the shadows fall just right. And rain chains. My grandmother had these copper ones that made the most incredible sound when it rained. We could hang them strategically, turn the rain itself into part of the display." He was pacing now, gesturing as he spoke. "And the lighting. Instead of just stringing up regular Christmas lights, what if we created this wave-like installation? Something that captures that rolling motion of the ocean during a storm, but with warm, golden lights that make it feel safe and cozy instead of threatening." Cassie felt her heart racing, excitement building with each suggestion. She scrambled for her sketch pad, nearly knocking over their salvageable pile in her haste. "Ethan, that's brilliant." Her pencil flew across the paper, trying to capture the images he was painting with his words before they could slip away. "We could use some of that sea glass we found last week for the light installations. The way it catches and reflects would be perfect." When she glanced up, she caught him watching her with a lopsided grin, an almost bashful expression crossing his features. "Well, teamwork and all that." The smile that spread across Cassie's face felt entirely natural, worlds away from her earlier despair. She shifted over on the wooden crate she'd claimed as a seat, making room for him to join her as she sketched. "Look, if we position the driftwood pieces here and here," her pencil traced bold lines across the paper, "we could create this amazing framework for the lights." Ethan settled beside her, close enough that she could feel the slight dampness of his sleeve against her arm. "And what if we suspended some of your surviving shell ornaments in between?" He reached over, finger pointing to a blank space in her sketch. They'd catch the light from multiple angles. They bent over the sketch pad together, ideas flowing faster than Cassie could capture them. The storm that had threatened to ruin everything had somehow sparked something new, something that felt bigger and better than her original vision. Each crack of thunder now felt less like an omen and more like applause, nature's approval of their evolving plans. The rain continued its steady percussion against the windows, but inside the lighthouse, the atmosphere had transformed completely. What had started as disaster recovery had evolved into a creative breakthrough, the energy between them crackling with possibility. Their earlier tension felt distant now, replaced by a shared excitement that made the cramped space feel alive with potential. Cassie found herself stealing glances at Ethan as he enthusiastically described his ideas for incorporating storm elements into their display. This was a side of him she hadn't seen before, passionate, creative, uninhibited. The usual careful guard he kept up had slipped away, replaced by genuine enthusiasm that transformed his whole demeanor. Their shoulders brushed as they hunched over the growing collection of sketches, adding details and refining concepts. Neither pulled away. The contact felt natural now, comfortable, in a way that would have seemed impossible just hours ago. They were no longer the reluctant partners forced together by circumstance. They were collaborators, each bringing something unique to their shared vision. Chapter 8: Lessons on Surf and Spirit. Ethan stared at Cassie in utter disbelief as she wrestled two battered surfboards from the depths of her garage. The ancient wood was scarred with countless dings and repairs, their once bright paint now faded to pastel ghosts of their former glory. "You cannot be serious." Her only response was a brilliant grin, blonde waves bouncing as she hoisted one board under each arm. The morning sun caught the highlights in her hair, creating a momentary halo effect that seemed entirely too appropriate for someone with her level of determined cheerfulness. "Come on, you've been cooped up working too hard." The thought of actually getting on one of those boards made Ethan's stomach do an uncomfortable flip. He planted his feet firmly in the sand, feeling the warm grains shift beneath his shoes. No way. I don't do that." His gaze drifted toward the ocean where waves rolled in with what seemed like increasing menace. "That?" Cassie quirked an eyebrow, amusement dancing in her hazel eyes. "You mean surfing? In a beach town?" She adjusted her grip on the boards, managing to look both graceful and slightly smug. "Shocker, I know." Her sarcasm hit uncomfortably close to home. Ethan scowled, but he couldn't argue with her logic. Surfing was practically a religion in Seaview Shores. He'd noticed that much in the few months since moving here. Every morning, the beach filled with devoted wave chasers, treating their boards with the reverence of sacred objects. The admission stuck in his throat for a moment. "I don't really know how." The words came out quieter than intended, and he found himself studying the intricate pattern of shells half buried in the sand rather than meeting her gaze. Something in Cassie's expression softened, and she shifted closer, nudging him with her elbow in a way that felt surprisingly conspiratorial. "Well, that's why you've got me. I'll teach you." The genuine warmth in her voice made it harder to maintain his reluctance. A group of locals caught his attention. They carved through the waves with an easy grace that made it look effortless. Their fluid movements only highlighted how out of place he felt. Still wearing his work boots at the edge of the beach, while everyone else seemed to live in flip-flops and bare feet. "I don't know, Cass." The nickname slipped out before he could catch it, feeling natural despite their relatively new friendship. "I'll probably just embarrass myself." The thought of flailing around in the water while these seasoned surfers watched made his chest tight. But Cassie was already in motion, somehow managing to toss him a board and a rash guard without dropping her own equipment. Her eyes sparkled with that familiar determination, the same look she'd worn when solving their storm-damaged decoration crisis. "Don't worry, we'll start on the baby waves. You'll be hanging 10 in no time." With a playful wink, she bounded toward the water's edge, her feet kicking up tiny sprays of sand. Ethan found himself smiling despite the nervous energy coursing through his body. The rash guard felt foreign in his hands, nothing like the practical work clothes he was used to. But watching Cassie's enthusiasm, her complete confidence in his ability to learn this completely foreign skill, made it hard to maintain his usual skepticism. The morning air carried the tang of salt and seaweed, and the steady rhythm of the waves created a soundtrack that was becoming increasingly familiar. A light breeze ruffled his dark hair as he watched Cassie pause at the water's edge, turning back to wave him forward impatiently. "Come on, slowpoke. The waves wait for no man," she called out, her voice carrying easily across the beach. A few early morning joggers glanced their way, smiling at her obvious excitement. Ethan looked down at the surfboard he now held. It was the less battered of the two, he noticed, wondering if she'd given him the better one on purpose. The wood was smooth beneath his fingers, worn to a subtle sheen by years of use and salt water. Small repairs dotted its surface like badges of honor, telling stories of adventures he couldn't quite imagine. With a deep breath that tasted of ocean spray, he stepped forward. His boots felt ridiculous now, and he quickly towed them off, leaving them in a heap beside a piece of driftwood. The sand was cool beneath his feet, still holding the memory of night despite the warming morning sun. "If I drown, I'm haunting this lighthouse forever," he called back, trying to match her light tone despite his apprehension. The threat only made Cassie laugh, the sound carrying across the beach like music. "Please, as if I'd let anything happen to my star pupil." She was practically bouncing with anticipation now, the water lapping at her ankles. Besides, the lighthouse could use a ghost. It would be great for business. Ethan rolled his eyes, but his steps didn't falter as he made his way toward her. The surfboard was awkward under his arm, nothing like the tools and materials he was used to handling during the renovation work. Yet somehow, watching Cassie's infectious enthusiasm, he couldn't bring himself to regret letting her talk him into this. The water touched his feet, surprisingly warm for the early hour, and Cassie's grin widened impossibly further. "Ready for your first lesson, landlubber?" "I'm already regretting this," he muttered, but there was no real resistance in his voice. Something about Cassie's presence made even the most daunting challenges seem manageable, whether it was salvaging storm-damaged decorations or learning to surf in front of the entire town. The frigid water hit Ethan like a physical shock, sending goosebumps racing up his legs as the first wave crashed against his shins. The ocean spray felt nothing like the warm morning air had promised, stealing his breath in an instant. "Geez," he yelped, stumbling backward as another wave slapped against his